An elite hospital prepares for an emergency surgery that was supposed to save 2 lives. But among scalpels and protocols, an imposter disguised as a nurse initiates a dark plan under everyone's eyes. On the other side of the door, a powerful husband silently watches the beginning of a carefully orchestrated tragedy. What no one expected was that the sedated woman would survive and turn her pain into a force impossible to silence. St. Raphael's Hospital in South London was known for catering only to the London elite. Imported marble covered the floors, artworks decorated the corridors, and the aroma of fresh lilies replaced the traditional smell of hospital disinfectant. It was there that Mary Ann Kingston was being prepared for an emergency C-section. At 7 months pregnant, complications from premature labor required immediate intervention. Her husband, Richard Kingston, was one of the most powerful men in the city. An executive at one of the country's largest construction companies, he also sat on the hospital's administrative board. His name opened doors, silenced voices, and guaranteed privileges few could attain. Mary Ann had always known the power the surname carried, but she never imagined that same power could be used against her. That June afternoon, as she was being wheeled to the operating theatre, Mary Ann felt something beyond the natural fear of any mother about to give birth. It was a diffuse sensation, a discomfort she couldn't name. Richard was beside her, but he seemed absent. His eyes showed no concern, only a coldness she had been noticing for months. He held his cell phone with more attention than her hand. The medical team worked with precision. Nurses organized instruments, the anesthetist prepared the sedation, and the obstetrician reviewed the protocol. Everything followed the expected standard until a woman, dressed as a nurse, entered the room. She wore immaculate blue scrubs, a badge hanging from her neck, and carried a clipboard. No one questioned her presence. She moved with the confidence of someone who knew every detail of that environment. Mary Ann, already under the effects of sedation, could barely keep her eyes open. Her eyelids felt heavy, and her consciousness floated between the present and a hazy state. It was then that she felt a close presence, someone leaning over her. She tried to focus her vision and saw the face of a woman she didn't immediately recognize. There was something familiar in those eyes, but her memory didn't respond. The fake nurse smiled, a smile that Mary Ann, even semi-conscious, perceived as inappropriate. It wasn't the reassuring smile of a healthcare professional. It was something different, laden with an emotion she couldn't decipher. The woman moved even closer, and her hands swiftly moved towards the oxygen equipment. Outside the room, through a small observation window, Richard remained still. His arms were crossed and his expression was unreadable. He did not show the typical anxiety of a husband awaiting the birth of his child. On the contrary, there was something calculated in his posture, as if he were awaiting the unfolding of an event whose outcome he already knew. Inside the operating theatre, the monitors began to emit alert sounds. Mary Ann's heart rate accelerated sharply. The nurses quickly approached, checking the equipment. The woman in blue scrubs, who had subtly disconnected the oxygen supply, immediately took control of the situation with unnerving calm. "It's just anxiety," she declared with authority. "Pregnant women in premature labor frequently experience stress spikes. I'll administer an additional sedative." The obstetrician hesitated for an instant, but the confidence with which she spoke and the badge she displayed convinced him. He nodded, allowing her to proceed. The other nurses, busy with their own protocols, didn't question it. After all, in a hospital of that size, dozens of professionals moved through daily, and it was impossible to know everyone. Mary Ann felt the air growing scarce. Her throat tightened, and a rising pressure took over her chest. She tried to signal, move her arms, make some sound, but her body wouldn't respond. The sedation held her prisoner within her own organism. Tears began to stream involuntarily from her closed eyes. The fake nurse observed everything with almost scientific attention. Her fingers lightly drummed on the clipboard as she awaited the right moment for her next action. But something unexpected happened. One of the oldest nurses at the hospital, Nurse Lucy, a 60-year-old woman who had worked there for 3 decades, entered the room at that exact moment. Lucy knew every detail of that operating theatre. She knew how the equipment sounded, how the lights flickered, how the environment behaved, and something was wrong. She immediately noticed that the oxygen tube was not properly connected. Her trained eyes identified the discrepancy in seconds. "Who disconnected?" "The oxygen?" Lucy asked firmly, addressing the woman in blue scrubs directly. The imposter remained calm. "It was necessary to adjust the flow," she replied without hesitation. "The patient was hyperventilating." Lucy didn't believe it. Her instinct, sharpened by years of experience, screamed that something was profoundly wrong with the situation. She approached Mary Ann and quickly reconnected the oxygen. The relief was almost instantaneous. Her heart rate began to stabilize, and color returned to the patient's face. The woman in blue scrubs realized her window of opportunity had closed. With discreet movements, she began to retreat towards the door. Lucy, still focused on Mary Ann, didn't notice the intruder's silent exit. When she finally turned to ask more questions, the woman had vanished. "What happened here?" the obstetrician questioned, finally realizing the gravity of the situation. "The oxygen was disconnected," Lucy explained, her voice firm but controlled. "If I hadn't entered at that moment, the patient could have gone into respiratory collapse." A heavy silence fell over the room. The nurses exchanged confused glances. No one remembered disconnecting the equipment. And that woman in blue scrubs, who was she? Why did no one know her? Lucy tried to remember. The face. But everything had happened so fast. She only knew there was something deeply disturbing in those eyes, a coldness that didn't match the profession they practiced. Outside, Richard finally moved. But it wasn't towards the operating theatre to check on his wife. It was towards the elevator, where he quickly typed a message on his phone. Just 2 words. It didn't work. The reply arrived almost instantly. "We'll have another chance." Richard put away his phone and took a deep breath. His face showed neither concern nor relief, only a cold resignation, like someone who had just lost a bet, but was already planning the next move. Meanwhile, in the operating theatre, Mary Ann was finally breathing normally. The procedure continued, and minutes later, the cries of a premature but healthy baby echoed through the room. A girl, small, fragile, but alive. Lucy carefully held the child and showed her to Mary Ann, who was still semi-conscious, but managed to give a weak smile. Something within her, however, remained restless. That feeling of having been on the brink of something terrible didn't leave her. The obstetrician declared the procedure successful, and everyone began to relax. The previous tension was quickly replaced by the post-delivery routine. But Lucy couldn't shake the discomfort. She knew she had witnessed something serious, something that went beyond a simple technical error. Later, when Mary Ann was transferred to the recovery room, Richard finally appeared. He entered with a bouquet of white roses and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Congratulations," he said, leaning in to kiss his wife's forehead. "Our daughter is beautiful." Mary Ann looked at him and tried to find the genuine emotion that should exist in that moment. But all she saw was a well-constructed mask, a calculated performance. And for the first time in their 5 years of marriage, she felt afraid of her own husband. The days following Helen's birth should have been filled with pure joy, but Mary Ann couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that female face leaning over her in the operating theatre, that inappropriate smile, those hands moving towards the oxygen. Was it just an effect of the sedation? A hallucination caused by the medication? Richard kept his distance, claiming work was especially demanding. He visited the hospital twice a day, always, with expensive gifts and imported flowers, but never stayed for more than 15 minutes. His calls were constant, and he always stepped away to answer them, speaking in a low voice in the corridor. Mary Ann observed everything through the half-open bedroom door. On the 3rd night after the birth, she woke with a start. Someone had entered the room. Through the dim light, she distinguished a female silhouette near Helen's crib. Her heart pounded, and she tried to scream, but her voice came out as a weak whisper. The figure slowly turned, and Mary Ann recognized the nurse's uniform. "Sorry to startle you," the woman said softly. "I'm from the night shift. I just came to check the baby's vital signs." But there was something familiar about that voice. Mary Ann strained her memory, trying to connect the dots. Before she could fully process it, the nurse had already left, leaving only a sweet perfume in the air. A scent Mary Ann was sure she had smelled before. The next morning, Lucy appeared for an unscheduled visit. The veteran nurse carried a worried expression she couldn't disguise. She carefully closed the bedroom door before approaching Mary Ann's bed. "Mrs. Kingston, I need to ask you some questions about the day of the birth," Lucy began, keeping her voice low. "Do you remember anything strange? Any detail that seems out of place?" Mary Ann felt immense relief. Finally, someone else noticed something was wrong. She recounted seeing the woman approaching her, that disturbing smile, the sensation of shortness of breath. Lucy listened attentively, nodding occasionally. "I knew it," the nurse murmured. "I knew it wasn't just a technical error. That woman wasn't part of our team. I checked all the entry logs for the operating theatre that day. The badge she was wearing belongs to an employee who has been on holiday for 2 weeks. The two women exchanged glances, the weight of that revelation hanging between them like a dense cloud. Someone had infiltrated the hospital, disguised as a healthcare professional, and had deliberately put Mary Ann's life at risk. But who and why? Lucy had more information. Over the past 3 months, there had been strange movements in the hospital's administrative records, altered documents, surgery schedules modified without proper justification. And all these changes had been authorized by someone on the administrative board, someone with a lot of power. Mary Ann didn't need to ask who that person was. She already knew. Her husband had unrestricted access to all the hospital's systems. He could easily manipulate records, authorize entries, create false credentials. But admitting that would mean accepting a terrifying truth. Richard wanted something to happen to her. Meanwhile, in another part of London, in the luxurious office of Kingston and Associates Construction, Richard was meeting with someone who was neither his partner nor a client. The woman sitting opposite him was the same one who had infiltrated the hospital. Her name was Andrea Foster, and her history with Richard was much longer and more complicated than anyone could imagine. "You promised it would be quick," Andrea said, her voice laden with frustration. "You said that in a few weeks everything would be resolved and we could finally be together." Richard stood up and walked to the panoramic window overlooking Oxford Street. There was a complication. That old nurse arrived at the wrong time. "But we'll have another opportunity." Andrea crossed her arms. "You're starting to sound indecisive, Richard. It makes me question if you truly want what you've always said you wanted." He turned abruptly, his eyes flashing. "Don't doubt me, I've built a perfect plan. Mary Ann is fragile after childbirth. Any medical complication would be seen as natural, but we need patience." What Richard didn't know was that his conversation was being monitored, not by official listening devices, but by something much more discreet and efficient. Weeks before Mary Ann's delivery, her father, Edward Thompson, a tech entrepreneur who had built an empire in digital security, began to distrust his son-in-law. Edward had always had a distant relationship with his daughter. He was a work-obsessed man who had lost his wife when Mary Ann was a child and never truly knew how to connect with his daughter. But his business instinct was sharp, and something in Richard's behavior in recent months had triggered his internal alarms. The construction executive had been asking questions about Mary Ann's asset structure, about inheritances, about how the Thompson family's testamentary clauses worked. These were subtle questions, disguised as legitimate interest, but Edward recognized them for what they were. Someone calculating values, weighing opportunities, planning something. Without telling anyone, not even his daughter, Edward hired Kyle Miller, a private security specialist who had worked for years for government agencies before opening his own company. Kyle was discreet, efficient, and had access to technologies few people knew about. The first measure was to install a micro-camera in the hospital room where Mary Ann would stay after the birth. Edward justified the choice by saying he simply wanted to ensure his daughter's safety during a vulnerable time. But Kyle went further. He also installed a tiny device in the operating theatre, hidden in a medical equipment stand, completely invisible to the naked eye. This camera was not connected to the hospital's official security system. It was an independent installation, transmitting directly to a private server monitored by Kyle. And it was this equipment that captured everything. The moment Andrea disconnected the oxygen, the expression on her face, the hesitation of the nurses, Lucy's life-saving intervention. But Kyle kept this information. Edward had been clear. He wanted concrete proof before acting. Unfounded accusations could destroy relationships, especially considering Richard's power and influence. A solid, irrefutable case needed to be built. Back at the hospital, Mary Ann began to piece together her own puzzle. She remembered small details from recent months. Richard coming home late with increasingly elaborate excuses. Women's perfumes that weren't hers. On his clothes, phone conversations abruptly interrupted when she entered the room. And there was something more. 2 weeks before the birth, she had found a visitor's badge from St. Raphael's Hospital in Richard's car, with a name she didn't recognize. Andrea Foster. When she asked about it, he simply said it was a consultant analyzing potential hospital investments. The explanation seemed reasonable at the time, but now it sounded like a poorly constructed lie. Mary Ann asked for her tablet and started searching. She typed Andrea Foster's name into social media, and what she found chilled her. The woman had a well-crafted professional profile, with a background in hospital administration and experience in several healthcare institutions. But that wasn't what caught Mary Ann's attention. It was an old photo, from 5 years ago, in which Andrea appeared at a corporate event for Richard's construction company. "She worked for you," Mary Ann stated aloud, even though she was alone in the room. The pieces began to fit together in a terrifying way. Richard and Andrea had a history, and somehow that history had evolved into something much darker, something that had put Mary Ann's life in real and imminent danger. Helen began to cry in the crib beside the bed. Mary Ann picked up her daughter and cradled her tenderly, feeling tears stream down her own face. How had it come to this? How had the man she married, the man she trusted, transformed into someone capable of planning something so terrible? The bedroom door opened, and Richard entered, bringing more flowers. He stopped when he saw Mary Ann crying. "What's wrong?" he asked, with a concern that sounded false even to himself. Mary Ann looked at her husband and, for the first time, didn't try to hide her feelings. She replied with a firm voice she didn't recognize as her own. "I'm just thinking about how life can change in an instant, how people we trust can turn out to be completely different from what we imagined." Richard remained motionless for a moment, his brain processing whether there was a veiled accusation in those words. Then he forced a smile and approached to touch Mary Ann's shoulder. She subtly recoiled, a small but significant movement. He noticed. The silence between them was dense, laden with unspoken truths and lies that were beginning to disintegrate. Richard knew he was losing control of the situation. Mary Ann knew she was beginning to see reality, and both knew that nothing would ever be the same again. A week after leaving the hospital, Mary Ann was at home trying to establish a routine with Helen when she received an unexpected visit. Her father, Edward Thompson, appeared unannounced, something rare for a man who always prioritized schedules and formal commitments. He carried a leather briefcase and a grave expression that immediately put Mary Ann on alert. "We need to talk," Edward said, sitting in the living room of the mansion Richard and Mary Ann shared in Kensington. "It's about your husband." Mary Ann felt her heart race. For years she had longed for moments of closeness with her father, for sincere conversations that went beyond polite greetings on special occasions. Now that this moment finally arrived, it was about her husband's possible betrayal and conspiracy. Edward opened the briefcase and revealed a series of documents. Bank statements, transfer records, payment receipts, all connected to Richard. "For 3 months I've been discreetly investigating his finances," the businessman explained. "Initially, it was just intuition, something in his behavior that didn't seem right to me. But what I discovered goes far beyond what I imagined." The documents showed significant monthly transfers to an account in Andrea Foster's name, rent payments for a luxury apartment in Notting Hill, expenses for expensive restaurants, jewelry, travel. Richard was supporting Andrea with company money, diverting resources that should have been allocated to projects and investments. But there was something even more disturbing. Edward pulled a photograph from the briefcase. It was an image captured by St. Raphael's Hospital's security camera, clearly showing Andrea dressed as a nurse, entering the restricted area of the operating theatre on the day of Mary Ann's delivery. "I installed additional security cameras in the hospital," Edward confessed. "It wasn't part of the official system. I was concerned Richard might try something during a vulnerable moment. I never thought my suspicion would be confirmed so literally." Mary Ann held the photograph with trembling hands. Seeing it materialized in an image made everything horribly real. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't imagination brought on by medication. It was a deliberate and planned attempt to cause an incident that could have had terrible consequences. Edward then revealed the most shocking information. "I also have a recording. The camera I installed in the operating theatre captured the exact moment she disconnected your oxygen. And it captured Richard outside, watching through the window, doing nothing to stop it." Mary Ann felt nauseous. Her mind tried to process that information, tried to find an alternative explanation that made sense, but there was none. Richard had planned it. He had allowed it to happen. He had hoped she wouldn't survive. "Why?" she murmured, more to herself than to her father. "Why would he do that?" Edward took a deep breath. "I believe it's a combination of greed and misguided passion. With you out of the way, he would inherit a significant portion of the Thompson family's assets, and he could be free to live with this woman without the complications of a public and costly divorce." The logic was cruel but coherent. Richard had always been ambitious, always calculating his moves with financial advantages in mind. Mary Ann had interpreted this as business acumen, as strategic intelligence. Now she saw it as absolute coldness, an inability to feel genuine empathy for anyone other than himself. "What do we do now?" Mary Ann asked, wiping away the tears she couldn't hold back. "Do we go to the police? Do we report him?" Edward shook his head. "We need to be strategic. Richard has powerful connections. Half the South London detectives were appointed by people who owe him favors. If we go through the usual police channels, he can stifle the investigation before it even truly begins." "So I'm trapped?" Mary Ann questioned, her voice laden with despair. "He tries to end my life and there's nothing I can do?" "I didn't say that," Edward replied firmly. "I said we need to be strategic. I have a friend who works at the Crown Prosecution Service, someone who cannot be bought or intimidated. We will present this evidence directly to him. But first we need to gather everything, every document, every recording, every witness. We need to build a case so solid that Richard has nowhere to run." While father and daughter talked, Richard was in a tense meeting with Andrea in a discreet hotel in the Canary Wharf area. The woman was visibly nervous, pacing back and forth across the room, while Richard remained seated, seemingly calm. "That old nurse recognized me," Andrea said. "I'm sure. She kept looking at me strangely when I left the room. What if she starts asking questions?" Richard sighed impatiently. "Lucy has worked at the hospital for decades. She won't risk her job and reputation for a vague suspicion. And even if she asks questions, what will she say? That she found a suspicious nurse? Without concrete proof, it's just speculation." But Andrea was not convinced. She knew the risks she had taken, knew she had crossed a line of no return. Richard's promise that they could be together, that she would be the new Mrs. Kingston, that they would have a life of luxury and prestige began to seem increasingly distant and improbable. "You promised it would be quick," she repeated for the 10th time. "You promised that in a few weeks everything would be resolved. A week has passed, and she's home, healthy, taking care of your daughter. Nothing is left of our plan." Richard stood up and approached Andrea, holding her shoulders firmly. "Listen carefully. Women who have just given birth are fragile. Anything can happen. A poorly treated infection, a post-delivery complication, a reaction to medication. There are 1,000 ways for something to go wrong, and all of them can appear natural." Andrea's eyes widened. "Are you serious? You still want to go through with this?" Richard didn't answer directly. Instead, he took out his phone and started typing a message. Andrea watched, trying to see what he was writing, but the angle didn't allow it. When he finished, he put the device away and smiled at her. "Trust me," he said. "Everything will be resolved. We just need a little more patience." What Richard didn't know was that Kyle Miller, the security specialist hired by Edward, had placed a tracker in his car. And not just a location tracker, but a device that also picked up audio. Every word of that conversation was being recorded and transmitted directly to a secure server. Kyle was in his office, listening to the conversation in real time through headphones. He took meticulous notes, recording every detail that could be used as evidence. When the conversation ended, he immediately called Edward. "Mr. Thompson, we need to accelerate our timeline," Kyle said without preamble. "I just overheard Richard and his accomplice. They're still planning something. Your daughter is still in danger." Edward felt his blood run cold. He had been at Mary Ann's house for almost an hour, and Richard could arrive at any moment. He thanked Kyle and hung up, turning to his daughter with urgency. "Mary Ann, you and Helen need to leave this house now. You'll stay with me for now. It's not safe for you to remain here." Mary Ann wanted to protest, wanted to say that this was her home, that she wouldn't be driven out of her own residence because of her husband's actions. But then she looked at Helen, sleeping peacefully in her portable crib, and realized it wasn't about her. It was about protecting her daughter. It was about ensuring they both survived to see justice done. She agreed with a nod. As she quickly packed some clothes and essential baby items, her phone vibrated with a message. It was from Richard. "I'll be home in 20 minutes. We need to talk." Mary Ann showed the message to her father. Edward checked his watch and quickly calculated. They had just enough time to leave before Richard arrived, but it would be close. "Let's go," he urged. 15 minutes later, Edward's car left the Kensington mansion. Mary Ann looked out the rear window, seeing the house where she had built so many. Memories where she had imagined raising her daughter, where she had believed she would have a happy life. All of it now seemed an illusion, a carefully constructed fantasy crumbling under the weight of reality. When Richard arrived home 5 minutes later, he found a disturbing silence. He called for Mary Ann, checked all the rooms, noticed the open drawers in the bedroom and some missing clothes. His first thought was confusion, but it quickly gave way to something far more dangerous: suspicion. "She knows," he murmured to himself. Somehow, she found out. Richard picked up his phone and dialed. "Andrea." When she answered, her voice was cold and controlled. "We have a problem. Mary Ann has fled, and if she fled, it's because she knows something. We need to act fast." Edward Thompson's penthouse in Mayfair offered security and privacy. The building had 24-hour surveillance, cameras on every floor, and an access system that required facial recognition. Mary Ann finally allowed herself to breathe when she crossed the threshold of her father's apartment, carrying Helen in her arms. Edward had already prepared one of the guest rooms, quickly transforming it into a suitable space for mother and baby. He had hired a trusted nurse to help with Helen and ensure Mary Ann could rest, but rest was the last thing on her mind. "I need to understand everything," Mary Ann said, sitting on the living room sofa while the nurse took Helen to the bedroom. "I need to know exactly what my husband planned, how long it lasted, who else is involved." Edward nodded and began to explain everything he had discovered over the past 3 months. Andrea Foster was not just a casual lover. She had worked at Richard's construction company 5 years ago as a human resources manager. The relationship between the two began then, but it was discovered by Mary Ann during a corporate party when she caught suspicious glances and gestures between them. Richard had promised to end the affair, and Andrea was dismissed with generous severance pay, which was supposedly to compensate her for the unfair loss of her job. Mary Ann believed everything was resolved. What she didn't know was that the relationship never ended. It just became more discreet and carefully hidden. Over the past 2 years, Richard began diverting resources from the construction company, Edward explained. Small amounts, initially, which grew over time. He created shell companies, bogus contracts, fraudulent invoices. The money went to an offshore account and from there was transferred to Andrea. She used these funds to maintain a lifestyle she couldn't sustain with her own work. Mary Ann felt increasing nausea with each revelation. How did I not notice any of this? How was I so blind?" "You weren't blind," Edward corrected gently. "You trusted. It's different. Richard built layers upon layers of lies. He is experienced in manipulation. He's probably been doing this for years with different people in different contexts." The businessman then revealed something he hadn't even mentioned during their first conversation. Over the past 6 months, Richard had also started asking questions about your will. He wanted to know how asset distribution worked in the event of one of the heirs' death, if there were specific clauses, if there were life insurance policies. Marianne closed her eyes, processing that information. Richard wasn't just planning an isolated incident. He was constructing a complete plan, calculating every detail, ensuring that he and Andrea would not only be free to live together, but also financially comfortable with the Thompson family's money. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Richard met with Andrea again. This time, the setting was an empty office in a commercial building the construction company had recently acquired. It was a location with no active security cameras, no entry logs, perfect for conversations that shouldn't be overheard. "She went to her father's house," Richard reported, pacing nervously around the empty room. Edward had always been protective of her, even from a distance. If he's involved, it means they suspect something. Andrea was pale. "I said we should have stopped after the hospital attempt failed. I said it was a sign that we shouldn't continue." Richard stopped pacing and stared at her coldly. "You want to give up? After everything we've done, all the risks we've taken, do you simply want to give up and go back to your mediocre life?" "That's not it," Andrea replied, but her voice trembled. "It's just that I'm scared. If we're discovered, if there's evidence, we could end up in prison." Richard gave a humorless laugh. "Prison? Do you think I'll let that happen? I have contacts, resources, ways to make evidence disappear. But I need to know exactly what they know. I need to know what proof they have against us." What Andrea didn't know was that Richard already had a backup plan. He had discreetly consulted a lawyer specializing in criminal law, using a false name and paying in cash. He had asked about theoretical hypotheses, about how someone could protect themselves if accused of a crime they didn't commit. The lawyer, unaware he was being used to build a real defense strategy, had provided valuable information. One of the suggestions was to create an alternative narrative, something that would explain the facts differently. For example, if there was a recording showing Andrea at the hospital, the defense could claim she was there for legitimate reasons, that she had been invited by Marianne herself to be present for emotional support. Any action that seemed suspicious could be reinterpreted as a misunderstanding or coincidence. Richard also began to plant seeds of a different narrative. He called some mutual friends of Marianne, casually commenting that he was concerned about his wife's mental health. He mentioned that she had been paranoid since the birth, seeing conspiracies where none existed, accusing people of absurd things. "Postpartum depression," he would say with feigned concern. "It's a serious condition. That can make a person lose touch with reality." These comments were strategically planted. If Marianne were to eventually accuse him publicly of something, Richard would have already prepared the ground for her allegations to be seen as the delusions of a mentally unstable woman. But while Richard built his defenses, Edward was several steps ahead. The businessman had arranged a meeting with Dr. Frederick Allen, a Crown prosecutor known for his integrity and for not being intimidated by powerful people. Frederick had prosecuted politicians, businessmen, and even members of the judiciary when he found evidence of crimes. The meeting took place at Edward's apartment for security and discretion. Frederick arrived accompanied by an assistant and, after formal greetings, sat down to hear the full account. Edward presented all the documents, the financial diversions, the transfers to Andrea, the security camera footage, the audio recordings from Richard's car. Frederick examined each piece of evidence with meticulous attention. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "This is a complex case. We have evidence of corporate fraud, diversion of resources, and an attempt to cause serious harm to a person. But we need to be careful in how we present this." "Why?" asked Marianne, who had joined the meeting. Aren't the pieces of evidence enough? They are, but your husband is an influential person, Frederick explained. He has the resources to hire the best lawyers, to drag the process out for years, to try to invalidate evidence on technical grounds. We need to build an absolutely irrefutable case, and we need to do it in such a way that when we present the charges, he doesn't have time to destroy more evidence or intimidate witnesses. The prosecutor then proposed a strategy. We will work on two fronts. First, I will discreetly initiate an investigation into the financial diversions at the construction company. This gives us the legal basis to request documents, summon witnesses, and examine bank accounts. Meanwhile, you need to gather more evidence about the hospital incident. We need formal statements from everyone who was in the operating theatre that day. Mary Ann immediately thought of Lucy, the veteran nurse who had saved her life. Would she agree to testify? Would she be able to face the pressure that would surely come from the hospital and from Richard? Edward had the answer. I've already spoken with Lucy. She is willing to testify. She saw what happened and knows it was wrong. But she's afraid of reprisals, of losing her job, of being defamed. We need to ensure her protection. Frederick nodded. I can arrange that. Once the case is officially opened, I can include her in the witness protection program. It won't be easy, but it's possible. The meeting extended for 3 hours. Every detail was discussed. Every possible complication was anticipated. Every defense strategy Richard might use was considered. When Frederick finally stood to leave, he looked directly at Mary Ann. Mrs. Kingston, what we are about to do will change your life completely. It will expose intimate aspects of your marriage, attract media attention, and be emotionally and mentally exhausting. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Mary Ann didn't hesitate. I am. It's not just about me, it's about all the women who are betrayed, manipulated, and put in danger by men who should protect them. If my story can prevent this from happening to others, then it's worth every second of difficulty that comes. Frederick smiled for the first time since he arrived. That's the attitude we need. I'll start working immediately. After the prosecutor left, Mary Ann remained alone in the room for a few minutes. Through the panoramic windows, she saw the lights of London flickering in the night. Somewhere out there, Richard was planning his next move. Andrea was waiting for instructions, and an entire structure of lies and manipulations was about to collapse. Mary Ann touched the cold window pane and made a silent promise to herself and to Helen. We will overcome this. We will expose the truth, and we will ensure that no other woman has to go through what I did. The war was just beginning, and this time Mary Ann would not be the passive victim. She would be the force that would bring down the entire house of cards Richard had built. 2 weeks after the meeting with Crown Prosecutor Frederick Allen, things began to move quickly. The investigation into financial diversions at Kingston and Associates Construction was officially opened under the pretext of a routine audit requested by minority shareholders. Richard initially didn't suspect anything. After all, audits were common in companies of that size. But when the auditors began asking specific questions about contracts he had personally approved, about third-party companies that had no real physical address, about payments to consultants who had never provided documented services, Richard realized something was wrong. He called an emergency meeting with his accountant and his corporate lawyer. The 3 men gathered in the construction company's boardroom, with the doors closed and explicit instructions not to be interrupted. Someone is investigating, Richard said bluntly, and it's not a common audit. They know exactly where to look. This is only possible if someone provided privileged information. The accountant, a middle-aged man named Sergio, was visibly nervous. Mr. Kingston, if there's a formal investigation, we need to cooperate fully. Any attempt to obstruct could worsen the situation. Richard slammed his fist on the table. I'm not just going to cooperate and hand everything over on a silver platter. There are ways to deal with this. Documents can be lost, digital files can be corrupted, witnesses can change their minds about what they really saw. The corporate lawyer, Dr. Marcus, intervened cautiously. Richard, as your lawyer, I must warn you that any action that could be interpreted as obstruction of justice will significantly worsen your legal situation. If there are accounting problems, it's better to admit errors, pay fines, and move on. But Richard wasn't interested in admitting anything. In his mind, he had built an empire through cunning and manipulation, and he wasn't going to let it all collapse because of an ungrateful wife and a meddling father-in-law. He was sure Edward was behind the investigation, even without direct proof. While Richard tried to contain the damage at the construction company, Mary Ann was taking important steps in her own life. She hired a family law solicitor, Dr. Paula Reynolds, known for representing women in complex cases of separation and domestic violence. Paula was a woman in her 40s, with a reputation for being relentless but fair. In her elegant office on Oxford Street, she listened to Mary Ann's entire account with professional attention, making notes and occasionally asking for clarifications. When Mary Ann finished, Paula leaned back in her chair and analyzed the information. This is not just a divorce case. It is a case of attempted grievous bodily harm, financial manipulation, fraud, and psychological abuse. We will immediately request protective orders. Your husband cannot approach you or your daughter. We will also ask for an injunction to freeze all joint assets, to prevent him from transferring or hiding property. Mary Ann nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and relief. Part of her still couldn't believe she had reached that point, that her marriage had turned into a legal battle, but another part, the part that was growing stronger every day, knew it was necessary. Paula continued, "Furthermore, we will work in conjunction with the prosecutor who is investigating the crimes. The evidence he gathers will strengthen your divorce case and vice versa. Your husband will find himself surrounded on all sides." That same afternoon, Mary Ann did something she had been avoiding for weeks. She called some close friends and arranged a meeting. For months she had socially isolated herself, partly due to the complicated pregnancy, partly because Richard subtly discouraged her from maintaining friendships he considered inconvenient. The three women met in a discreet cafe in Mayfair. Camilla, Felicity, and Julia had been Mary Ann's friends since university. They had noticed the gradual distancing but respected her space, believing Mary Ann was simply focused on her pregnancy and preparing for motherhood. When Mary Ann began to recount what had happened, the three were in absolute shock. Camilla, always the most emotional of the group, began to cry. Felicity, more pragmatic, immediately offered any help Mary Ann needed, and Julia, who worked as a journalist, had a different reaction. "Mary Ann, what you've told me is material for an investigative report," Julia said carefully. "I'm not suggesting you do this now, but when the time is right, publicly exposing what happened could be important, not only for you, but for other women going through similar situations." Mary Ann hadn't considered that possibility. The idea of making her story public was terrifying, but at the same time, there was something powerful in the suggestion. Keeping everything secret was exactly what Richard wanted. He was counting on her being too ashamed or too scared to speak openly. "I'll think about it," Mary Ann replied, "but for now, I need to focus on ensuring he faces legal consequences for what he did." The friends spent the rest of the afternoon supporting Mary Ann, offering practical and emotional help. When she returned to her father's apartment that night, she felt less alone than she had in months. Meanwhile, Richard's situation continued to deteriorate. The audit at the construction company had uncovered irregularities totaling millions of pounds, fraudulent contracts, payments to phantom companies, systematic diversions that had been happening for years. The board of directors called an extraordinary meeting, and Richard was confronted with the evidence. He tried to argue that they were accounting errors, misunderstandings, problems with the financial management system. But the numbers were too clear, the patterns too consistent. The board voted for his temporary suspension until the investigation was concluded. Richard left the meeting furious and humiliated. Upon arriving home, he found a judicial notification waiting for him. It was Mary Ann's request for a protective order, accompanied by a petition for contentious divorce with detailed accusations of psychological abuse, manipulation, and attempted grievous bodily harm. The document also included a request to freeze all joint assets. Richard read every word with growing disbelief. How dared she do that? How had she, who was so fragile and dependent on him, found the courage to defy him in such a way? In his distorted mind, Mary Ann should have been grateful for everything he had provided, should silently accept his decisions, and disappear when he no longer wanted her. He immediately called Andrea. When she answered, her voice was tense. "Richard, I'm being followed. There's a car parked in front of my building. I'm scared." Richard tried to sound reassuring, but his own fear began to show. "It's probably just paranoia. But let's be careful anyway. Don't communicate with me except through burner phones, and don't leave home unless it's absolutely necessary." After hanging up, Richard sat in silence in his empty mansion. For the first time, he began to consider the real possibility that he could lose everything. The company, the money, his reputation, perhaps even his freedom, and all because he had underestimated his wife. In Edward's apartment, Mary Ann was putting Helen to sleep when her phone rang. It was Frederick Allen, the prosecutor. "Mrs. Kingston, I have important news. We've obtained judicial authorization to access all your husband's bank accounts, including the offshore ones. What we've discovered is substantial. There's enough evidence to file formal charges." Mary Ann felt her heart race. What kind of charges? Corporate fraud, diversion of resources, money laundering. "And we're working on the hospital case." Nurse Lucy gave a formal statement, very detailed and consistent with the recordings we have. "We are close to being able to include charges related to the incident in the operating theatre as well." "How long until the charges are officially filed?" Mary Ann asked. "A few weeks. We want to ensure we have everything perfectly documented. When we move, it has to be definitive. No room for appeals or technicalities that could invalidate the case." Mary Ann thanked him and hung up. She looked at Helen, sleeping peacefully in her crib. Everything she was doing was for that innocent child, to ensure she grew up in an environment of truth and justice, not lies and manipulations. She left the room silently and found her father in the living room, reading documents. Edward looked up and noticed something different in Mary Ann. There was a new determination in her gaze, a strength he hadn't seen since she was a teenager, before she met Richard and allowed him to gradually undermine her self-confidence. "Are you all right?" Edward asked. Mary Ann nodded. "I'm more than all right. I'm ready. Ready to face whatever comes. Ready to fight. Ready to ensure the truth is known." Richard thought he could silence me, that he could erase me. But he was wrong, and soon the whole world will know it. The bomb exploded on a Tuesday morning. The main London newspapers plastered the news on their front pages that would shake the city's elite. Construction executive accused of £1 million fraud and conspiracy against wife. Richard Kingston's photo took up half the front page, alongside images of St. Raphael's Hospital and figures detailing the discovered financial diversions. The report, written by an investigative team from one of the country's largest media outlets, contained details that shocked the public. It described how Richard had systematically diverted resources from the construction company, maintaining a second life with a mistress, and how he had allowed this same woman to infiltrate a hospital, disguised as a nurse during his wife's delivery. What made the news even more impactful was the inclusion of excerpts from the recordings made by Kyle Miller. Obviously edited to protect identities and comply with legal requirements, but clear enough to show conversations between Richard and Andrea, discussing their intentions. The most quoted phrase across all social media that day was, "Women who have just given birth are fragile. Anything can happen." Mary Ann was not prepared for the public impact. Even knowing that the story would eventually come out, the speed and intensity with which it spread caught her by surprise. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Messages of support, interview requests, curious people wanting details. She turned off the device and asked her father to answer only essential calls. Julia, her journalist friend, was one of the first to call. "Mary Ann, I know this must be difficult for you, but you need to know that public reaction is overwhelmingly in your favor. People are shocked by what Richard did. There's a wave of solidarity on social media. Hashtags calling for justice, women sharing their own stories of abuse and manipulation." Mary Ann didn't know if this comforted her or frightened her even more. Her personal story had become part of a national conversation about violence against women, abuse of power and impunity. It was bigger than she had imagined. Meanwhile, Richard was locked in a discreet hotel, trying to manage the crisis his life had become. His phone also wouldn't stop ringing, but the messages he received were very different. Partners demanding explanations, clients cancelling contracts, lawyers warning about imminent legal consequences, and his own family, whom he had kept distant from everything, demanding to know if the accusations were true. Andrea was in an even worse situation. Her photo had been published alongside the report, identifying her as the accomplice who infiltrated the hospital. She lost her job immediately. Her name became synonymous with betrayal and predatory behavior. On social media, she was vilified as the woman who tried to harm a vulnerable mother. The threats she received were so intense that she had to temporarily change her address. 3 days after the report was published, Frederick Allen formally filed criminal charges against Richard and Andrea. The press conference called by the Crown Prosecution Service was broadcast live on several television channels. The prosecutor, with his serious and professional demeanor, detailed the accusations: corporate fraud, diversion of resources, money laundering, and conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm to a vulnerable person. He explained that the evidence included financial documents, audio and video recordings, and testimonies from multiple witnesses. "These are not accusations we make lightly," Frederick declared. "We have a solid case, built on months of meticulous investigation. The accused will have every right to defend themselves, but the evidence speaks for itself." Richard's defense, now composed of a team of 5 high-caliber criminal lawyers, immediately published a statement denying all accusations. They claimed that Richard was the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by his father-in-law, a powerful businessman who had always opposed the marriage. They suggested that the recordings were edited out of context and that the financial documents resulted from accounting errors, not deliberate actions. But the defense strategy faced a fundamental problem. There was too much evidence. The recordings were extensive and consistent. The financial documents showed clear patterns of systematic diversion. And there were witnesses like Lucy, whose credibility was difficult to question. The case quickly became the most discussed topic in the country. Television programs debated the legal and ethical aspects. Opinion columns explored the power dynamics in abusive relationships. Organizations supporting women victims of violence reported a 50% increase in calls to their helplines, with women finally finding the courage to report similar situations. Mary Ann, advised by her solicitor and the prosecutor, decided to give a single exclusive interview. She chose a respected investigative journalism program, known for treating sensitive topics with seriousness. The interview would be recorded at her father's apartment, in a controlled and secure environment. The journalist who conducted the interview, Beatrice Sanders, was known for her empathetic but direct approach. She began by asking Mary Ann about when she had realized something was wrong in her marriage. Mary Ann thought carefully before answering. "There were signs, small details I ignored or justified. Richard was always controlling, but I interpreted that as protection. He always knew exactly what to say to make me feel like I was overreacting, that I was too sensitive, that I saw problems where none existed. It's hard to explain what it's like to be inside a relationship like that. From the outside, it seems obvious. From the inside, you are constantly questioning your own perception of reality." The interview continued for almost an hour. Mary Ann spoke about the day of the birth, about the moment she realized she was in real danger, about the decision to leave her home and seek protection. She also spoke about Helen, about how motherhood had given her a strength she didn't know she possessed. When Beatrice asked about her feelings towards Richard now, Mary Ann took a deep breath. "I don't feel hatred. I feel pity. Pity for a man so consumed by greed and selfishness that he was capable of endangering the life of his daughter's mother. And I feel determination. Determination to ensure he faces the consequences of his actions, and that other women see it's possible to leave such situations, that it's possible to rebuild." The interview aired 3 days later and had one of the highest viewership ratings of the year. The impact was immediate and profound. Mary Ann became, in a way, a symbol of resistance and rebuilding. But she was uncomfortable with that role. She didn't want to be a symbol. She just wanted justice and peace. Meanwhile, pressure on Richard and Andrea mounted from all directions. The construction company's board voted for Richard's definitive removal from all executive positions. His assets were judicially frozen, his passport was seized, and he was notified that he should regularly report to the Crown Prosecution Service while the investigation proceeded. Andrea, realizing she was being seen as the main villain by public opinion, tried one last play. Through her lawyer, she offered to collaborate with the investigation in exchange for reduced charges. She said she had additional information about other crimes Richard had committed, including cases of corruption involving public officials. Frederick carefully considered the offer. There was strategic value in having Andrea as a witness against Richard, but he also knew that she had actively participated in serious actions. After discussions with his team, he decided to accept the collaboration, but made it clear that Andrea would still face significant consequences for her actions. Andrea's testimony, given under the terms of her collaboration, revealed surprising details. She described how Richard had meticulously planned the hospital incident, how he had used his contacts on the administrative board to obtain a false badge for her, how he had studied the operating theatre protocols to identify vulnerabilities. She also revealed something that even the investigation hadn't discovered. There had been a previous attempt. 3 weeks before the birth, Richard had asked her to visit Mary Ann at home and offer her a drink mixed with sedatives, hoping to cause pregnancy complications. Andrea had backed out on that occasion, fearing discovery. But the hospital attempt was the secondary plan. This revelation left Mary Ann deeply shaken. It hadn't just been a moment of calculated coldness during childbirth. It had been a continuous and deliberate effort to harm her. The extent of the betrayal was almost incomprehensible. Edward, upon learning this additional information, felt a rage he rarely experienced. He had always been a controlled, rational man who solved problems through strategy and planning. But the idea that someone had repeatedly tried to harm his daughter and that he hadn't realized in time to completely prevent it tormented him. "Father," Mary Ann said when she noticed Edward's torment, "you saved my life. If you hadn't installed those cameras, if you hadn't been suspicious, I might not be here now. Don't blame yourself for what could have happened. Focus on what you made happen, justice." Edward embraced his daughter for the first time in years. Between them, finally, the barriers of distance and formality they had maintained for so long began to crumble, replaced by a genuine connection forged through shared adversity. 6 months had passed since Mary Ann Kingston's story became public. The legal process against Richard and Andrea was underway, moving slowly through the British legal system, but advancing steadily. The evidence presented by the Crown Prosecution Service was so solid that even the best defense lawyers found it difficult to effectively challenge it. The trial was scheduled to take place in 3 months, and the expectation was for significant convictions for both accused. Richard faced charges that could result in decades of imprisonment, including corporate fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm. Andrea, even with her collaboration, still faced serious charges related to her infiltration of the hospital and participation in the scheme. But for Mary Ann, the focus was no longer solely on punishing the guilty. She had begun a process of rebuilding her own life, redefining who she was beyond being the woman who had survived that monumental betrayal. The divorce had been granted 3 months ago, in a relatively quick hearing considering the circumstances. The judge presiding over the case had no doubt in determining that Richard had violated all fundamental principles of marriage, and that Mary Ann was entitled not only to separation, but also to substantial financial compensation for the damages caused. The division of assets was particularly favorable to Mary Ann. In addition to receiving half of the couple's assets, as stipulated by law, she also received compensation for emotional distress damages that included significant amounts. The judge determined that Richard had caused profound psychological trauma and put Mary Ann's life at real risk, justifying the additional compensation. With financial resources secured and her freedom regained, Mary Ann made a decision that surprised even those closest to her. She announced the creation of the Free Voices Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting women victims of domestic violence, psychological abuse, and manipulation in relationships. The Foundation's headquarters were established in a renovated historic building in Notting Hill. The space included reception rooms, offices for volunteer solicitors and psychologists, a library with resources on women's rights and mental health, and even temporary apartments where women and their children could stay while reorganizing their lives. The inauguration of the Foundation was an emotional event. Dozens of women attended, many with their own stories of survival. Partner organizations, family law specialists, psychologists, social workers, all were present to support the initiative. Mary Ann, holding Helen in her arms, ascended the small stage set up in the building's central courtyard. She had prepared a speech, but when it was time to speak, she decided to improvise, speaking directly from the heart. A few months ago, I was lying in a hospital bed, unaware of the real danger I was in, surrounded by people who should have protected me but failed, manipulated or intimidated by someone who had power and influence. I woke from that experience not only with a beautiful daughter, but with a profound understanding of how silence can be as dangerous a weapon as any other. She paused, looking at the women gathered before her. For years, I allowed my voice to be silenced. I allowed someone to make me believe that my perception was wrong, that my concerns were exaggerated, that I should be grateful for the privilege of being alongside a powerful man. And I almost paid with my life for that silence. Tears streamed down the faces of many present. They recognized their own stories in Mary Ann's words. This foundation is not about revenge or hatred. It is about recovery and liberation. It is about giving women in similar situations the tools, support, and courage to rebuild their lives. It is about showing that no matter how powerful your abuser is, no matter how many people he knows or how much money he has, you have a right to truth, justice, and freedom. The applause that followed was warm and prolonged. After the speech, Mary Ann spent hours talking individually with women who approached to share their stories, to ask for advice, to simply thank her for seeing someone transform pain into purpose. Lucy, the veteran nurse who had saved Mary Ann's life at the hospital, was present at the inauguration. She had retired from St. Raphael's Hospital after the scandal, not because she was forced, but because she felt it was the right time to close that chapter of her life. Now she had volunteered at the Foundation, using her decades of experience to help other women. When Mary Ann saw her, the two women embraced for a long time. "You saved more than my life that day," Mary Ann said. "You saved my future. My daughter's future. I can never thank you enough." Lucy smiled with tears in her eyes. "You are saving many other lives now. That's all the thanks I need." As the Foundation flourished, the legal case against Richard and Andrea continued to advance. The preliminary hearing had established that there was sufficient evidence to take the case to full trial. Defense lawyers tried various appeals, arguing technical issues about evidence admissibility, attempting to disqualify witnesses, but all were denied by the judges. Richard was visibly different. The man who once exuded confidence and power now appeared in court with a stooped posture, his face marked by months of stress. His corporate empire had collapsed. The construction company that bore his name was in liquidation. His former friends and partners distanced themselves, protecting their own reputations. Andrea, in turn, seemed to have aged years in a matter of months. The woman who had infiltrated the hospital with such confidence now avoided eye contact with anyone. Her collaboration with the investigation had provided valuable information, but it had also confirmed her active participation in extremely serious actions. 3 months after the Foundation's inauguration, the day of the trial finally arrived. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, curious onlookers, Mary Ann's supporters, everyone wanted to witness that moment. Security was reinforced to prevent disturbances. Mary Ann was present, seated in the front row reserved for victims and family. Her father was beside her, holding her hand. Dr. Paula Reynolds, her solicitor, was a few seats ahead, ready to testify if necessary. Across the aisle, Richard and Andrea sat with their respective defense teams, carefully avoiding looking in Mary Ann's direction. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Witnesses were called, evidence was presented in minute detail, arguments were made by both sides. The prosecution, led by Frederick Allen, built a meticulous and irrefutable case. Each piece of evidence was corroborated by multiple sources. Each witness was consistent in their accounts. Lucy testified about what she saw in the operating theatre, her voice firm and clear as she described how she found the oxygen disconnected and how she recognized that it was not an accident. Kyle Miller explained the surveillance systems he had installed and how the recordings had been maintained under proper chain of custody. Forensic accountants detailed the financial diversions, showing undeniable patterns of systematic fraud. The most impactful moment of the trial was when Mary Ann took the stand to give her testimony. The room fell into absolute silence as she recounted, with a controlled but emotional voice, what it had been like to be in that operating theatre, feeling the air run out, realizing something was terribly wrong, and then discovering that the person who should have protected her had allowed it to happen. "I looked into my husband's eyes after the birth," she said, "and I saw a stranger, someone I thought I knew, but who in reality I never truly knew. And the most frightening part was not the physical danger I faced, but realizing how many years of my life I had given to someone incapable of true love, incapable of empathy, incapable of seeing another human being as more than an obstacle to his own desires." When it was the defense's turn, Richard's lawyers tried to argue that his actions were the result of financial pressures, undiagnosed mental health problems, external influences. They tried to portray Andrea as a manipulator who had seduced him and led him down a path of bad decisions. But none of the arguments were convincing, given the volume and quality of the evidence presented by the prosecution. After the closing arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. 3 days later, they returned with the verdict. The tension in the room was palpable as the jury foreperson stood to read the decision. In the case of Richard Kingston, the jury finds him guilty of all charges: corporate fraud, diversion of resources, money laundering, and conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm to a vulnerable person. The recommended sentence is 35 years of imprisonment, with no possibility of parole for the first 15 years. A murmur swept through the room. Richard lowered his head, his hands trembling on the table in front of him. His lead lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, but there were no words of comfort that could change the reality of that situation. In the case of Andrea Foster, the jury foreperson continued, considering her collaboration with the investigation, the jury finds her guilty of conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm and illegal infiltration of a medical facility. The recommended sentence is 25 years of imprisonment, with the possibility of review after 15 years, considering her cooperation and expression of remorse. Andrea began to cry silently. Unlike Richard, she had shown genuine signs of remorse during the trial, acknowledging the gravity of her actions and asking for forgiveness, even knowing that such forgiveness would probably never come. The judge presiding over the case brought down her gavel, formalizing the sentences. It is the responsibility of this court not only to punish criminal actions, but also to send a clear message to society. That power and privilege do not protect anyone from consequences when laws are violated. That vulnerable women have a right to protection and justice, and that those who betray the most fundamental trust, the trust within a relationship, will not be tolerated. After the sentencing, Mary Ann was surrounded by reporters outside the courthouse. She had prepared a brief statement. "Justice was served today, but my focus now is not on the past. It is on the future we are building at the Free Voices Foundation. It is on every woman who finds the courage to leave an abusive situation. It is on my daughter, who will grow up knowing that her mother fought not only for herself, but for all women who deserve to live without fear, without manipulation, without forced silence." In the following months, Mary Ann's life continued to transform. The foundation grew, expanding its services and reaching more women. Helen was developing wonderfully, surrounded by genuine love and protection, and Mary Ann discovered a version of herself that had been buried for years under layers of doubt and fear, a strong, resilient woman capable of transforming trauma into purpose. A year after the trial, the foundation organized a special event. Women who had been helped by the organization were invited to share their stories of rebuilding. The auditorium was full, with people seated even in the side aisles. Mary Ann took the stage to close the event. She held Helen, now 1.5 years old, in her arms. The girl played with her mother's necklace, oblivious to the significance of that moment. "When I began this journey," Mary Ann said, "I just wanted to survive. I wanted to protect my daughter and ensure the truth was known. But I discovered that surviving isn't enough. We need to thrive. We need to refuse to let our experiences define us as permanent victims. We are survivors. We are warriors. We are voices that refuse to be silenced." She looked at the audience, seeing faces of women at different stages of their own rebuilding journeys. Some still carried visible marks of their struggles. Others had already advanced significantly in their healing processes. All shared a common characteristic: courage. The motto of this foundation is, "You are not alone. You are not forgotten. You are free." And I want to add a line to that. You are stronger than you think. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And your future is in your hands. The applause that followed was deafening. Women stood up, tears streaming down smiling faces. It was a moment of collective celebration, of recognition that shared. Pain can transform into shared strength. After the event, as people dispersed, Edward approached Mary Ann. Their relationship had completely transformed over the past year. The formal distance had given way to genuine closeness. He was learning to be not just a provider father, but a present father. "I'm proud of you," he said, and there were tears in his eyes. "Not just for what you survived, but for the person you've become through it all." Mary Ann hugged her father. "I wouldn't have made it without you. Without your intuition, without your protection, I might not be here today. And now together, we are helping others have the same chance I had." That night, after everyone had left and Helen was sleeping peacefully, Mary Ann was alone in the Foundation's office. On the walls were photographs of women who had passed through there, stories of rebuilding and hope. On her desk was a pile of thank you letters, messages of support, requests for help from women across the country. She picked up a pen and began to write in her diary, a habit she had developed during therapy in recent months. Her therapist had suggested that documenting her thoughts and feelings could aid in the healing process. "A year ago," she wrote, "I was fighting for my life in a way I never imagined necessary. Today, I am living a life I never imagined possible. I learned that strength isn't never falling. It's getting up every time you fall. It's transforming scars into wisdom. It's using your pain to prevent others from suffering the same way." She paused, looking out the window at the lights of London flickering in the night. Richard was serving his sentence in a penitentiary. Andrea was in another, reflecting on the choices that led her there. And Mary Ann was free, truly free for the first time in years. "Helen will grow up knowing only the truth," she continued writing. "She will know that her mother faced something terrible, but didn't allow it to define her. She will learn that women are strong, that voices matter, that no one has the right to silence another person. And perhaps, just perhaps, she will grow up in a slightly better world because people decided that enough is enough." Mary Ann closed the diary and turned off the office light. Tomorrow there would be more work to do, more women to help, more stories to hear. But today she would allow herself to simply exist, simply breathe, simply be grateful for being alive and free. As she left the building, she looked up and saw stars shining through the city's light pollution. One of them seemed to shine more brightly than the others. She smiled, took out her phone, and snapped a photo, sending it to the message group with her friends, with her father, with everyone who had supported her journey. The message accompanying the photo was simple but powerful: free to shine. Dear listeners, we hope that Mary Ann Kingston's story and her journey of survival and rebuilding have deeply touched your hearts. This narrative shows us that even in the most difficult situations, when we are betrayed by those we trust the most, there is always hope for a new beginning. If you were moved by Mary Ann's courage and the transformation of her pain into purpose through the Free Voices Foundation, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life, the challenges we face, and the strength we discover within ourselves. We want to know what you thought in the comments. What part of the story touched your heart the most? Do you know anyone who has gone through a similar journey of rebuilding? Share with us. To continue experiencing emotions like this, explore our special playlist with other incredible stories. We await your comments.